You're listening to Skate of Thrones, your go-to podcast for dialed-in LA Kings coverage.
Welcome back to Skate of Thrones, the podcast that dials in on the Los Angeles Kings. As always, I'm your host, Casey Kasliner. As for the second night in a row, the Kings go to the shootout, but this time fall to the rival Anaheim Ducks. Final score 2-1. It was a very back-and-forth game. The Kings did not really play well and couldn't get much offense going during the first 40 minutes. They go down 1-0 and then eventually tie up the game late, but they couldn't get the job done in the shootout. Of course, won last night in the shootout against the Dallas Stars, had a back-to-back heading into the Four Nations face-off break, and that'll certainly be a game here against Anaheim that the Kings would like to have back. Of course, the Ducks have been hot lately. They've won 6 of their last 7 and undoubtedly are not a free win by any means, but the Kings, of course, have picked up their offense and would have liked to pick it up again here tonight, but just couldn't, and they lose 2-1. Speaking of the Four Nations face-off, news broke during the game that Drew Doughty will replace Alex Pietrangelo for Team Canada in the Four Nations face-off. He talked about that in the post-game, how he's such a competitive guy, and to not be on the roster, be out with an injury for so long was really hard for him. And of course, now he'll compete then. It'll be good for him to get some extra reps, kind of still gelling back into the game after missing so much time. So good for Drew Doughty. He'll join Adrian Kempe, who will represent Team Sweden. Speaking of Adrian Kempe, he had the lone goal for the Kings tonight. He also was placed as a defenseman in this game. And Jim Hillard talked about it in the postgame, really because Adrian Kempe can outskate really anybody in this league if he puts his mind to it. He's certainly the best skater on the Kings. He played on the blue line, made some good defensive plays, and set himself up for a goal. And that was a really nice goal set up by Philip Deneau. And Deneau last night was a great passer. Of course, he struggled a bit this year, but set up Kempe well in the slot, and it got past Lukas Dostal, the goalie for the Ducks. And I want to talk about him for a moment. Lukas Dostal is obviously, I think, a future Vezina candidate. He's been absolutely incredible this year. He's top 4 in the league in goals saved above expected, just showing why he's been so highly touted, such a young guy. He had a great game tonight. Easily could have won in regulation had the Ducks not folded a little bit late, but Dostal made 43 saves, and I want to give credit also to David Riddick for the Kings. Of course, he played last night, maybe didn't have the best game, but still got out of there with a win. Comes on the back-to-back, but for David Riddick, a guy who's had some struggles this year, it's certainly tough as well. But he ended up having a really nice performance, making 25 saves on 26 attempts. Of course, couldn't get it done in the shootout, but we know that the Kings have gone to overtime and beyond that the past 2 games now. And for David Riddick, I mean, he's putting in the work, and you have to give him props. Kemper was out for personal reasons, it was listed as. The Kings actually called up Phoenix Copley, but he did not play. So an interesting thing. I mean, it's also the Kings' 3rd game in the last 4 days, and they've had to play a lot. So to head into a break now and then continue the homestand when they come back for the break is huge. And I'm sure, they'll have their eyes on the Four Nations face-off, but it is like an all-star type break that they can focus on other things. It felt like in the first 40 minutes, the Kings' energy wasn't the problem. They had some chances set up by Alex Laferriere, Kevin Fiala had some looks, other guys as well, but connectivity and the offense just seemed like it was battling friction a lot, was troubled when trying to create looks. Quentin Byfield had a few point-blank looks right at the top of the crease and couldn't get a good finish. The Kings were setting up well on some occasions, but when you're playing against a goalie like Dostal and you also sometimes are shooting yourself in the foot, it's tough to get stuff going. And the Ducks obviously are a team that's considered a bottom feeder this year, but like I mentioned, they've had some good games lately. They're a team that has shown lately they've been able to put goals on the board, and the Ducks have been one of the worst offenses in the league this year. And the Kings have had some rough stretches, but heading into February, of course, they've shown otherwise. And the Kings had also won the previous 2 matchups, both in Anaheim. So a matchup the Kings liked, but of course, playing Riddick back-to-back nights can be tiresome. Jim Hiller changed a lot of stuff around with all the lines early on. He was putting guys in the 3rd line on the 1st line and vice versa, moving a lot around to create something. There was a deadlock through those first 40 minutes. Neither team could score on the power play. The Kings had a moment in the 3rd period where they had back-to-back power plays. I believe it was only 3 real-time minutes between those 2 power plays and could not get much to go. And the Ducks really skated by. I mean, the Ducks' defense wasn't great tonight. The Kings were able to evade their D-men on multiple occasions, but I can't say it enough. Lukas Dostal with some great saves, showing why he is a premier goalie in this league. One thing I forgot to mention is the Kings rolled with 11 forwards and 7 defensemen, taking out Akil Thomas from the fourth line, adding on Kyle Burrows. Obviously, the 11-7 has been great for the Kings historically, but they just couldn't create much offense tonight. I don't know if the 11-7 was necessarily the reason for that, because the Kings' fourth line has been unproductive by and large for a lot of the season, but of course, they just couldn't get much to go. One thing again, Brandt Clark played 13 minutes. We mentioned last night he also played 13 minutes. So just one thing to monitor. I'm not looking too far into it. I know that he's a guy that's been so highly praised in the Kings organization, but of course his minutes have gone down, and it feels like they want more defense out of him. So I'm just monitoring that. On a different note, the Kings celebrated Trevor Lewis's 1,000th game played. They had a cool ceremony at the beginning of the game. Obviously, Lewis won 2 Stanley Cups with the Kings, left and came back, and had a pretty emotional celebration for Lewis. He played in his 1,000th game a little bit ago, but they celebrated it tonight, and definitely a cool moment. He had his family out there. And you would have thought that the Kings, on this offensive tear lately, playing against Anaheim defense that's a lot of offensive defensemen, a lot of young guys, a lot of inexperience, especially considering that Radko Gudas did not play tonight for the Ducks. He had an illness that sidelined him, and so you would have maybe expected something different, but I really just think the Kings were tired. I think fatigue comes with playing 3 games in 4 days, also going to a shootout last night, and what was such a hard-fought game. I think it took all the energy out of that. So I think it took all the energy out of the Kings. So not reading too far into it. I mean, they're going to go on a break now. One interesting thing about the Ducks is they had a 5-forward power play, had nothing to go. Obviously, we've seen the Kings do that. I just think it's interesting considering the inexperience for the Ducks. Also, I didn't see Leo Carlsson out there for the power play. And so just one thing that I found to be intriguing on the Ducks side, and their offense struggled tonight as well. Really couldn't get much going, had a few good looks, and their goal was from Brian Dumoulin, and that was his first goal of the season. Kind of just an unlucky break for the Kings. Dumoulin had a really good look, finding his way out of the slot and taking a nice shot from the left side. But overall, Riddick did very well tonight. I'm not faulting him at all, even if my expectations were maybe different for him coming in, given that he played last night. Speaking of Trevor Lewis, he had some opportunities tonight as well, just couldn't capitalize on them. Alex Turcotte had some nice setups. And I think another thing for the Kings is their offense was plagued a lot by not adjusting well out of the neutral zone. And the Anaheim Ducks defense, like I mentioned, is not necessarily bad, but it's inexperienced, and they sometimes would not take advantage of some of the gaping holes that it was giving them. And that's why they got a lot of looks on Dostal. I mean, he made 43 saves. He put in a lot of effort tonight, but the Kings could only find the back of the net once. The Kings are now 17-3-2 at home. They still have such a great home record. The Pacific is looking as close as can be. The Vancouver Canucks had a nice 2-1 win over the Maple Leafs tonight, so that moves them just 2 points behind the Kings, and Calgary remains 5 points behind LA, while the Oilers and Knights, the respective 1 and 2 teams in the Pacific, still create some ground. Both are tied at 72 points. So it's really a 2-legged race for the Pacific Division, with the Kings lingering in third. But I said this last episode, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Obviously, there's still 30 games left, give or take, in the season, and I think the Kings would love to not have to play the Edmonton Oilers again. It's not like Vegas is an easier matchup, but of course, it's something different, something the Kings can prepare for differently. Looking way ahead past the Four Nations face-off, the Kings will continue their homestand. After the break, we'll have Utah, Vegas, and Vancouver at home, and then we'll go on the road again. Obviously, I'm looking at those Vancouver and Vegas games. Those are going to be very important for the aforementioned standings I brought up, but will be interesting. We'll have a lot of time off, and I'm sure there will be some storylines that emerge even with the break, given the fact that the Kings, by and large, have been playing very nicely heading into the break, and I think that's something you want, something you can sleep on. The Kings, after this win, extend their point streak to 4 games, have won 3 of their last 4. Obviously, that was coming off a losing streak of 4 games, but I think to have something to hang your hat on and go into a break with a little bit of momentum is solid, especially because you're going to give Drew Doughty the opportunity, like I said, to get some reps with Team Canada, really get back into the swing of things. We know what he can do when he's on. He had some good looks tonight from the high slot, creating some chances, but nothing went into the back of the net. So we'll keep an eye on him just to see how he adjusts. But importantly, the Kings will have Darcy Kemper back, and they'll also have hopefully a more established system they can roll with. It feels like they've made a lot of moves on the fly, like tonight, going back to the 11-7. Not necessarily a bad thing, but just something that they can maybe plan ahead for when they come back. But we'll see what happens. So you won't hear from me on this podcast for a little bit. Of course, make sure to be in the loop with my social media at Casey Kasliner on both Instagram and Twitter, where I will analyze what the Kings do in the meantime. But their next game will be on February 22nd, which feels like an eternity from now, but they'll play Utah, another game they'd like to take away and continue this streak of nice performances and continue being solid on offense in the month of February. But that's just going to about do it from me. I'm your host, Casey Kasliner. Thank you so much for tuning in to Skate of Thrones. We'll have more coming your way once the Kings play again. And thank you again for listening. Have a great one and good night.